Welcome to Impact Tactical, the channel that talks about Canadian firearms, gear, and gun laws. Today we'll be taking a look at our new Remington 700 AAC-SD. Welcome back. I'm Chris Carr with Impact Tactical. And sitting in front of me today, we have a brand new Remington 700 AAC-SD in 308 with a 16-inch factory threaded varmint barrel on it. It also has, as it is one of the new generations, we have the new X-Mark Pro triggers. This one has come from the factory after the recall, so this one has not had to be recalled and repaired. This is the new version that they're putting out with the smooth face triggers. The idea for this project came around from the fact that we're going to be building a 1,000 yard range at our local gun range. So we wanted to put together a project keeping the overall length as small as possible when in its folded state to try and come as close to the 26-inch overall length as per Canadian law. Now right away we're going to have people saying that the barrel's too short. We do understand that we're going to have some muzzle velocity issues that we're going to have to work with. But since the main goal of the project is to stay as close to 26-inch overall at the end of the build, if we end up needing to make this a 800 yard rifle rather than 1,000, then so be it. And later on in the project, once we get closer to the final build, we're going to be playing with some hand loads and seeing what we can get out of the barrel as is. Down the line, who knows, we may, if we decide to upgrade the barrel, we may go to a 20-inch barrel, which would solve that issue for us. But we'll see what happens. So to start off the build, we're going to be mounting a Weaver tactical scope base, as well as some TSR rings and an older Falcon Optics 4-14 first focal plane scope that we had left over from an earlier build. We're also going to be leaving a link in the description to a video by John McQuay over at 8541 Tactical. He does a great video on bedding these Weaver rails using an epoxy base, as well as these TSR rings. He used both of them on his budget precision rifle build, and that's actually where we got a lot of the ideas for the base rifle for our build today. Once we get the scope mounted, we'd like to make our next video out at the range once we get some match ammunition in, which should be arriving in the mail hopefully early this week, depending on if we end up having a postal strike or not. That being said, when we do receive the ammunition, we're going to be doing some baseline accuracy tests. That way we have some data to compare to once we finish the build. Hopefully we'll be able to see an accuracy improvement over factory stock. That being said, let's get to mounting the base. So the first piece that we're going to be installing today is a Weaver one-piece tactical scope base. It is the extended version as well. It does come with a recoil lug on the front portion of the base that's going to actually attach right here onto the front of the receiver and help mitigate scope movement during recoil. So the first things we're going to have to do is we're going to have to remove the machine screws from the top of the receiver that came with it from the factory. So let's just zoom down in here so you guys can see what's going on. So the screws are just small flathead screws, so we're just going to be careful when we're taking these out not to strip the screw heads. Otherwise we're going to end up having to machine them out, which for us means having to take them to a machine shop. Okay. So we're just going to store these screws in a safe place. If we were to decide to take off the base for any extended period of time, I would recommend putting these back in. It'll just help to prevent any contaminants from entering the receiver and get in the way of your threads the next time you try to mount something. Now the next step is going to be to actually mount the scope base onto the top of the rifle. One thing we've already done ahead of time is we have mounted this to the receiver and noticed that there is a little bit of a gap on the rear lugs. So what we're going to have to do would be basically to bed this base. Now normally what would be done, as you'll see in the video we linked in the description, is we would use an epoxy compound and actually apply it to the bottom of the scope base on the part that actually is out of spec, and temporarily attach it in a way that it's not going to bond to the top of the receiver using some wax or an oil of some sort. But we want to try something a little different today. Let me just reach over here. We actually came across this little bit of, it's actually just like a foil tape for like air ducts and things like that. But when we did measure the scope base, which you'll see us do once we get attached in a second, we noticed under the rear of the scope base, using a set of these feeler gauges, there happened to be exactly 5/1000th of an inch of gap under the rear of the scope base, and that just happens to be exactly the thickness of the tape. So what we've gone ahead and done is we've cut out a small piece of the tape that fits exactly over the rear of the scope base. So what we're going to do now is we're going to affix this onto the scope base, punch out a hole for the screws to come through, and then we're going to mount this down on top of the receiver. Okay, so we have our base here. We're just going to go ahead and flip it over. And now, peeling the backing off of the tape, we're going to be very, very careful and try to apply this perfectly to the back of our base. Try that again. And just try and get out any extra air bubbles. You can already see that it's going to leave an outline pretty clearly of our screw holes. So now what we're going to do is I'm just going to use actually a dental pick, and we're going to just say cut out these screw holes. You want to be careful not to scratch the actual aluminum base. We don't want to create any burrs. So I'm using the flat edges of the pick, and we're pushing it sort of in around the sides of the hole. There, actually removing a little piece there. So again, the key being we don't want any burrs sticking down on the face that's going to be touching the receiver. So I'm going to be very careful to push any excess material inside the hole. It's not going to get in the way of the screw heads when it's there. As you see when I flip it over, there's a lot of room on the inside edge. Okay, so let's see how this turned out. I think that's pretty perfect. So as you can see, we don't really have any burrs, and it's mated pretty much perfectly actually with the sides of our receiver. With the sides of our base. So now we're going to go ahead and mount this to the top of our receiver, and then we'll check the fitting again. Okay, so we're going to start by placing our scope base with our new sort of bedding compound on the back on the top of our receiver. By the way, also I apologize if in the background you hear what sounds like gunshots. It's actually Canada Day when we're recording this. And it's a little bit later at night now, so some people are starting to let off the fireworks. So we're going to start by placing one screw in the rear of the receiver. Don't get it stuck upside down. And we're just going to start now getting the screws lined up with the holes. But we're not going to be tightening anything down. Just basically starting them in threads. Okay, so now as you can see, we have our base attached, but just very loosely. Now you'll remember we mentioned that right under this section of the base, we actually have a recoil lug. So what we're going to want to do is, anytime we're tightening, we're going to want to push firmly on the base forward to seat that lug firmly up against the front of the receiver. That way, as the rifle recoils rearward and the scope wants to travel forward, it can't because it's stopping against that lip of the receiver. So what we're going to do now is we're just going to go through and just tighten, hand tighten all the time. I'm pushing with my thumb on the back of the receiver, the back of the scope base. We're just going to tighten them down snug. There. So now we've pushed it as far forward as we can while snuggling them down just basically finger tight. Okay guys, so for the rings, we're going to start by mounting the first one at the most rearward slot on the rail. It's just where I happen to like mounting it. And again, with the rings, we're going to push a little bit forward as we tighten them down. And our second ring, we're going to put in the slot up here. I think it's 1, 2, 3, fourth last slot. Push it up against the rail a little bit. Okay, so those are in there nice and hand tight. One of the things is we just want to make sure that there's no grease or any other residue in the rings, on the screw holes, basically any of the contact surfaces. Okay, so now we're going to torque the rings down onto the rail. So let me just get my torque wrench set up over here. It seems to be working fine now, so we're going to go ahead and give it a shot. Okay, just get these on there started. .65 inch-pounds. Okay, so let's see. Up around 50, 55, 65, right there, okay. And the same thing over here. Oh, this one's a little closer, 65, right there. And keep in mind, if you don't have a torque wrench, 65 inch-pounds still isn't a whole lot of torque. So you definitely don't want to over tighten these. If you're having to do it by hand, basically once you get them snug, just put a little extra force on with the wrench. You can always come back later and check. I would suggest picking up a torque wrench. I would not suggest, now after having some time with it, picking up one of these Mastercraft drive adapters. They're garbage in my opinion. We're going to be looking at getting a dedicated, excuse me, a dedicated Borka Tools torque wrench in the future. Something we can keep specifically in the gun drawers for when we're doing projects like this, because really you do need a good quality torque wrench, and we found that inch-pound torque wrenches in specific are getting a little harder to find. So Borka has put out a pretty good product. When we do get one in, we'll probably do a video on that, just showing you guys sort of what the features are and why we like them. So this is our Falcon Optics 4-14 first focal plane scope. Like I said before, we pulled it off of one of our older projects. I love this scope. It's definitely not the most advanced or even the most modern scope out there by any means, but it's a good quality optic. It's had a lot of years in use, and we've never had any problems with it. It gives me what we need. We'll do if you guys really want, we'll do probably a quick little video just on the scope later. Right now I kind of want to get this project finished. So we're just going to basically set the scope up in the rings for now to check our distances. Anywhere around here should be fine. Again, I'm going to adjust that a little bit more once we get out to the range and we can get down on the ground. But for now, this should be fine. The other thing to take note of is we're a little bit limited, just more with the way the scope is designed than anything. Up at the front here, because we do have a 44mm objective, it gets a little close to touching this rail. So where we're set up right now, this scope ring is set to a point where we can't go back far enough to hit the rail anyway. So we're going to go back as far as we can and then just kind of take a little distance off so it's not sitting up against the bell. And I think that would be pretty much perfect. And it gives us a little adjustment room. We can still go forward by about 1/4 inch if we need to. Okay, so as we mentioned before, these rings are a little unique. It's going to be hard for you guys to see in the video, but on one end of these rings and on the matching lower as well, there's a little sort of dimple. Those ends have to meet up. This is just the way that TPS makes their rings. So basically we're going to just drop the first set on top. And just throw our screws in. Get everything lined up here. Okay, so for these specific rings, as we mentioned, the side with the index marks on them, we're going to tighten those sides first. And they're just going to get, sorry, we'll just kind of tighten them as evenly as we can here. Okay. So right now they're literally just to say they bottomed out. What you'll notice, if you look at this side of the video, I don't know how well you guys can see, there's a decent sized gap on this end, and it's perfectly flush on the other side right now where my finger is. This is the way that they design the rings. It's apparently to take out any intolerances in the scope tube between manufacturers. So what their instructions are is we're to tighten down the index mark half of the ring. We're not going to be using a torque wrench for the rings at all. There is no torque spec on these. They advise you to just simply use the torque wrench provided, which is what I'm using, and to tighten them down as much as you can by hand without using too much force. So basically we have this half of the rings now snugged down. The other cool thing it does is it lets us still rotate and move our scopes back and forth. Keeping in mind though, you don't want to be kind of moving around too much in the rings. You could end up scratching your scope tube. So we're going to go ahead and tighten down the other side of the rings. So we'll start by just getting them, by just basically taking the looseness out, getting them down to the contact, right about there. And now again, I actually almost kind of wish they would give you some torque specs on these. I do like having them. So I know I didn't screw something up. I get a nice even torque on them, something I can check. But this isn't too bad either. So we're just going to go back and forth, a little turn on each, so they come down evenly. We'll see where we end up. I'd say that's probably about as tight as I want to go. I can feel it cinching down now, and I don't want to over tighten. So that looks about good right there. So we'll just drop our screws in, just like we did on the other side. We'll get them lined up in a second. Oop, no. Okay, so we've got the screws just dropped in right now. So we're going to start on the index mark side like we did last time and just get them tightened down. Okay, so that side's tightened. Now again, for this side, we don't really need to worry about adjusting anything now because the pressure from the rear scope caps have locked kind of the scope in place. And So we're already set as far as that goes. So we're just going to drop these screws all the way down. So now that they're in there, we're just going to torque them down by hand. One at a time like before. Again, remember, you don't want to go overkill on these. You just want to make sure that they're nice and tight. That seems good. Alright, now that we've got our scope mounted up on the rifle, the next job we're going to have is getting out to the range like we had mentioned to do some of the accuracy testing. We're going to leave a link down in the description on where you can get some of the parts, as well as a link to the video by 8541 Tactical on bedding a rifle scope base and some of the other parts that we used today. Don't forget, if you liked our video, please like, share, and subscribe. We appreciate it, and it helps us put out more content. As well as don't forget to like us on Facebook at Impact Tactical, and we'll see you the next time. Welcome back. I'm Chris Carr with Impact Tactical. That's interesting.